The first major milestone in wealth accumulation is widely considered the most difficult, not because the math changes, but because the physics of money are fundamentally weighted against you at the start. When you are starting from zero, every dollar you accumulate is the direct result of traded time and physical labor, meaning your capital growth is strictly linear and tied to your finite energy. At this initial stage, the primary engine of your financial progress is entirely internal, requiring a high savings rate and a deliberate suppression of lifestyle inflation, while the surrounding economy exerts a constant drag through taxes, inflation, and living costs. This is the period of maximum friction, where the emotional tax of sacrificing current consumption is highest, yet the visible progress is lowest, causing the vast majority of people to abandon the process before hitting the critical mass required for momentum. The $100,000 threshold represents the rough mathematical tipping point where the structural nature of wealth accumulation undergoes a fundamental phase shift from labor-driven input to capital-driven growth.
To understand why this specific number acts as a psychological and mechanical dividing line, we have to look at the shifting ratio between your human capital and your investment capital. Below $100,000, even an exceptional annual investment return of 10% on a $20,000 portfolio yields just $2,000, an amount easily eclipsed by a minor unexpected expense or a single month of diligent saving. This creates a psychological trap where the rewards of investing feel completely disconnected from the effort required to save, leading many to believe that the system is either rigged or ineffective for the average earner. However, once a portfolio crosses the six-figure mark, that same 10% return generates $10,000 per year, a baseline that begins to rival or exceed the raw annual savings capacity of an average household. This is the exact moment where the money itself begins to do the heavy lifting, effectively acting as a silent, automated coworker that funnels capital back into the engine without requiring an extra hour of your personal time.
The mathematical mechanics behind this transition are deeply rooted in the compounding formula, where the variable of time acts exponentially, but only if the principal amount is large enough to survive the drag of real-world expenses. If you chart the trajectory of wealth accumulation, the time required to go from $0 to $100,000 is almost always longer than the time required to go from $100,000 to $200,000, despite the absolute dollar increase being identical. This occurs because during the second 100,000, your capital is compounding alongside your ongoing savings, meaning you are no longer climbing the hill alone. You are being pushed from behind by the returns of your existing assets. Mathematically, the first six figures can take up to a decade of intense discipline for an average earner, while the subsequent double can occur in less than half that time under normal market conditions, demonstrating that wealth generation is an accelerating system rather than a steady, linear progression.
When we zoom out to the broader economic system, we see that modern financial architecture is explicitly designed to reward aggregation while penalizing fragmentation. Small amounts of capital are routinely eroded by microfees, low-yield banking structures, and the structural necessity of spending a higher percentage of total income on non-productive, depreciating survival assets like rent and basic transport. Conversely, crossing the $100,000 threshold grants access to structural efficiencies, lower institutional costs, and the ability to weather macroeconomic volatility without being forced to liquidate assets at a loss during a market downturn. This systemic bias means that capital preservation becomes significantly easier once you have reached a critical baseline, as you transition from a consumer vulnerable to daily economic friction to an owner of capital that absorbs the productivity of the marketplace.
Ultimately, crossing this mathematical threshold forces a permanent identity shift in how an individual perceives the concept of value and time. You stop viewing money as a token for immediate consumption or a temporary safety net, and you begin to view it as a deployable inventory of autonomous economic units that work on your behalf. The anxiety of immediate survival gives way to the strategic calculation of long-term positioning, allowing you to make decisions based on decades rather than the next billing cycle. Achieving this baseline configuration is less about the specific currency units accumulated and more about surviving the linear labor phase long enough to let the systemic mechanics of compounding take over, permanently changing your relationship with the economic landscape.